We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these our fellow Australians. We apologise especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country, for the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind. We say sorry.
The government recognises that the absence of an apology has been an impediment to healing and reconciliation. The Government of Canada now recognises that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes, and we apologise for having done this. The Government of Canada sincerely apologises and asks the forgiveness of the Aboriginal peoples of this country for failing them so profoundly.
Well, an apology is essential for the nation that's conquered or stolen an Indigenous people's country and then impose policies to remove their children or to try to socialise people out of their own cultural and communal value systems. It's important to acknowledge that these were officially sanctioned activities of the colonisers, of those that came and took the land, removed the children from their country, from their people, and from their opportunities to understand their own traditions and their spirituality. And once there is an apology, which was made by our Prime Minister a couple of years ago, when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, once that's made, it enables the debate and argument around that to be put to one side and then to focus on how you might go forward. There's still a need for compensation and for positive programs to deal with the consequences, particularly of those who were subjected to these heinous policies. It was described pretty much by the Commission of Inquiry that was headed up by an ex-High Court judge and assisted by my younger brother, Mick Dodson, as this policy was described as genocide. So it was an attempt to completely destroy the Indigenous peoples of Australia by removing their children and then socialising those children out of their culture and into a Anglo viewpoint. Now, also an apology acknowledges that not only were those policies of separating and taking people away, but that there was a culture and a way of life that is quite different to what the British and the colonial Australian people established, that was linked to land, to spirituality, and linked to a communal dimension that was integrally connected to land, and that uniqueness was also severed. And so there's an opportunity now to rethink not only the relationship between peoples, but also how the building on the relationship with the country, with the land itself, can better be constructed. So it does open up two avenues for improving the basis of our relationship. Without an apology, none of that becomes very possible. In fact, it becomes a difficulty to engage in dialogue with government, and certainly a difficulty for the Indigenous peoples to seriously feel part or included into the mainstream environment and culture and society where their values are able to be sustained and where they may have some influence on reshaping and restructuring the mainstream values. So it's absolutely important that it is done. I think it's also important that there has to be compensation for to those families and those individuals that were the subject of those heinous policies, because they were terrible things. A lot of people suffered under them. A lot of people were abused. A lot of people never ever found their mothers, never ever were reunited back to their country. And a lot have developed all sorts of anxieties that have never been healed, and some have gone to their graves with that unresolved. And those that are living have still got It's remarkable, their resilience, but there is a void. And that void, I think, has to be met as best a society, like a modern democratic society like Australia, how that can respond to that in fiscal terms or through some form of compensation.
And the policy from 1938 onwards was to prevent the Aboriginal population from increasing and to force the Aboriginal population to assimilate. And so the way that they achieved this was by removing children from their families, forcibly removing part Aboriginal children or half-caste or quarter-caste children from their families and putting them into institutions where they were trained to be domestic labour or farm labour. So thousands of Aboriginal children were removed and placed into institutional care. Their lives were severely damaged. Many of my friends came from this background. And I know at first hand how emotionally damaging that the incarceration in institutions and often fostering into families where they were used as cheap labour was. For some people it was a happy experience, but for so many people it was far from the kind of childhood that, each child is entitled to. Where genocide has occurred, there must be repatriations. And a part of the repatriation process, according to international law, is an apology. And so many Australians denied this history and continued to deny this history. Many of the people who deny that this occurred really are putting the argument that, well, it was the best thing for Aborigines because their families are so backward, their way of life is so backward. They argue that the Aboriginal people were being rescued. Aboriginal children were being rescued from an Aboriginal way of life. And so it's basically a racial argument, it's a kind of fascism, that's being argued. It's a kind of ethnic cleansing argument that's being argued. And they can't see that they themselves are participating in, the genocide and the genocidal argumentation. So I felt it was tremendously important to put the case clearly. Now, despite the best efforts of many people of the stolen generations, they were not by themselves able to convince Australians that an apology was necessary. I felt their campaign was brilliant. They asked Australians to sign what they called sorry books, and thousands of Australians signed books to say that they were sorry. Essentially, the nation was built on the theft of Aboriginal land, the destruction of the Aboriginal population, which involved, at least in part, removing children from their families in an attempt at enforced assimilation. And most Australians did not want their children to inherit a nation based on a crime against humanity. There were the stories too of the people who had adopted Aboriginal children in good faith without understanding what they'd become involved in. And there were the stories of the brutal institutions where children were abused. And so the apology allowed the nation the honour that it wanted, that Australians wanted. And without an apology, the stain continued. And people were so relieved by the apology. There were thousands of people all over the country watching the apology on television screens, in workplaces, in public places, even in London, and wherever Australians are in the world, they watched the apology on television. And it made a difference. It made an enormous difference. And so many people said after the apology that it had made a difference to the way they felt about being Australian. And for many of us, it also meant that then we could move on from that problem, which had become the centre of the debate about Australia's Indigenous people, and we could move on to the pressing problems of the levels of disadvantage which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people suffer in employment, education, health, and start addressing those problems. Without the apology, we would not be able to do that.
The Obama administration recently issued an apology, but he didn't do it in anybody's presence. And so what you have is, my analysis of this is that at what point does a child mean it when he says he's sorry, right? Is this at 5 or 6? You kicked your sister? Are you sorry? Right? At what point is remorse actually a conscious emotion that means something? What I believe that the United States does not actually have the political, emotional ability to show remorse. And so we're dealing with a very immature child who believes it's entitled to things and never should have to say it's sorry. I mean, the reality is when the descendants of the survivors of the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1990 asked for a formal apology from U.S. Congress, asked that the 23 medals of honor that were given to the troops who killed the Indians would be stripped, Tom Daschle said, quote, "If we apologize to those Lakotas, we'll have to apologize to a lot of other people too." And so that whole question of having it have meaning, this, is an ongoing issue because there is a lack of any accountability for any behavior, which accentuates the denial of historic trauma, which exists in all of these Indigenous communities because the events and destruction and genocide which occurred is not acknowledged as having occurred. And so people suffer from the fact that what happened is invisible. And in this era, you have maybe somewhat politically correct people even. You have people who say, we want to help you, but they lack the depth of understanding of the trauma, of the problem, and become much more on the surface apologists. And we remain largely, I would argue, unable to fully heal. Because saying you're sorry has to mean something, and it has to change your behavior. That's what you would tell a 5-year-old, is you can't kick your sister again. It has to mean something. Well, opening up a new mine after you say you're sorry is not changing your behavior. Running a bulldozer over a sacred site is not changing your behavior. Allowing, egregious contamination into a community after apologizing is not changing your behavior. As Mandela said, is that the perpetrator also carries this weight of the crime and becomes his own victim in that dynamic of having done something egregious. And so in that guilt, the perpetrator is not healthy either. So the process of apology and redemption, or forgiveness, is a mutual healing process. As consciousness changes, as individuals who live and have grown accustomed to empire begin to question empire because of its deep psychological, spiritual, ecological, and economic implications. It is an opportunity to do the right thing and to begin that process of reconciliation. Because as, the South African experience taught us, the perpetrator and the victim are engaged in a relationship in which both lose some of their humanity. In recovering your humanity, you become a better person. And I believe you become a better society.